They thought she didn't belong until she did what none of them could. The classroom was massive, rows upon rows of neatly arranged desks, a towering chalkboard at the front, and walls lined with framed achievements of the institution's brightest minds. The kind of room that felt designed to remind students just how small they were in the grand scheme of academia. Jasmine stood at the entrance for a moment, scanning the space, already feeling out of place. Not because she doubted herself. She had spent years preparing for this, but because she knew exactly how this would go. She took a deep breath and walked in, clutching her notebook as she weaved through the sea of students already seated, most of them white or Asian, a few turning their heads as she passed. Maybe they were just curious, or maybe they were wondering the same thing the professors would soon ask. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Dr. Whitmore, a sharp-dressed man in his mid-50s, spotted her as she took a seat near the middle. His eyes lingered for just a second too long. Then Dr. Langley, a balding man with an expensive watch and an air of smugness, walked up to the podium. "All right, welcome to Advanced Calculus," Langley started, flipping through his notes without looking up. "Before we begin, let's make sure everyone is where they need to be. This is not a general math course. If you're looking for something more introductory, now's the time to make that correction." A few students chuckled. Jasmine knew exactly what he meant. She didn't react. She just pulled out her pen. Dr. Whitmore glanced in her direction, then leaned toward Langley, whispering something. Langley nodded, adjusted his glasses, and cleared his throat. "You," he said suddenly, pointing right at Jasmine. "What's your name?" The room went silent. Jasmine blinked. She wasn't the only new student here, so why was she being singled out? She could feel the stares closing in on her, waiting. "Jasmine," she said, her voice steady. Langley gave a slow nod, as if rolling the name around in his head. "And you're certain you're in the right class?" There it was, the question she'd been expecting. "Yes," she said simply. Langley forced a smile, a polite but dismissive one. "All right then," he said, turning back to the board. "Let's begin." But Jasmine caught the look he exchanged with Whitmore. One of amusement, of certainty that she wouldn't last. She'd seen that look before, and she knew exactly what it meant. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Jasmine sat through the lecture, forcing herself to focus on the equations being scrawled across the board rather than the silent weight of eyes on her. It wasn't paranoia. She could feel it. The subtle glances, the quiet, almost imperceptible smirks exchanged between students. She wasn't new to this. She had spent most of her academic life being underestimated. But it never got easier. Dr. Whitmore was explaining a proof, something deep in the realm of real analysis, a complex concept that should have taken time to break down. But he rushed through it, assuming that only the worthy students would keep up. Jasmine could keep up. But when she raised her hand, he barely glanced her way. "We're moving on," he said, turning back to the board. Jasmine lowered her hand. She heard a faint chuckle from the row behind her. The pattern continued over the next few weeks. Whenever she solved a problem quicker than expected, there was a pause, a moment of hesitation from the professors before they brushed past her answer and redirected the discussion. If another student repeated her response minutes later, it was suddenly worth a deep dive. Other students picked up on it. Some followed their lead, ignoring her, pretending not to hear her contributions. Others just watched, unsure, perhaps afraid to step out of line. One afternoon after class, she overheard a conversation between two students as they packed their things. "She's trying way too hard," one of them muttered. "Like, relax," the other snickered. "Langley's definitely going to wash her out before finals." Jasmine didn't flinch. She had heard worse. But as much as she tried to act like it didn't matter, something inside her was shifting. It wasn't that she needed their approval. It was the sheer audacity of it all. The way they assumed she was doomed from the start. The way they had already decided her story for her. She had to remind herself who she was. Late at night, when the library was mostly empty, she would sit alone, pages of advanced calculus sprawled in front of her, working through problems faster than the curriculum required. She studied for herself, not for them. But despite her efforts, the tension was still building. Then one morning, Dr. Langley walked into the lecture hall with a gleam in his eye. "All right, I have something for you all today," he said, tapping the chalk against the board. "A midterm challenge. A problem so difficult that not a single student in this class will solve it." A wave of murmurs passed through the room. Langley smirked. "Consider it a lesson in humility." His eyes flickered toward Jasmine. She knew what this was, but he had just given her the perfect opportunity. The room fell silent as Dr. Langley turned to the board, his smirk widening as he chalked out a dense, sprawling equation. It wasn't just long, it was designed to be intimidating. Took up almost the entire board, a mess of integrals, limits, and abstract symbols that seemed to defy logic. He stepped back, dusted his hands off, and turned to face the class. "This," he said, "is an unsolved problem, a proof that has baffled even graduate-level mathematicians. If anyone in this room can solve it, well, I'll personally recommend them for an immediate research position." A few students chuckled, shaking their heads. Jasmine stayed quiet. She recognized the problem. She had seen variations of it before, buried in obscure mathematical journals she used to read for fun. Langley leaned against the desk, arms crossed, waiting. After a long pause, a confident-looking student in the front row picked up his pen. The class watched as he scribbled something in his notebook, frowned, then scratched it out. Another student tried next. He got a few lines in before stopping, staring at the board as if it had personally insulted him. Langley smiled. "Told you." More students attempted it, but one by one they gave up. Jasmine's fingers tightened around her pen. She could do this. She knew she could do this. But she also knew what would happen next. If she got up there and solved it, it wouldn't be a victory. It would be a challenge. It would make her a target. She exhaled. Then she stood up.